Good afternoon and welcome to this week's Iowa Learning Farms webinar, our conservation webinar series. I'm Matt Helmers with Iowa State University, ISU Extension and Outreach, Iowa Nutrient Research Center, and also involved with the Iowa Learning Farms. And it's my great pleasure to get to host the webinar again today. And it's great to have a colleague from the University of Iowa here with the Iowa Geological Survey. So Dr. Matthew Streeter, a research soil scientist there with the Iowa Geological Survey, is going to talk to us today about infield and edge of field opportunities for nutrient reduction at a community college. So they've been doing some work with Kirkwood there in Eastern Iowa, some great work. And so we had a field day over there last year, and I think it's a great opportunity for Dr. Streeter to talk about some of that work, as well as give a little primer on some other research work that they have going on with alternative intakes. So as always, if you have questions or comments, feel free to type those in the chat box, and we'll get those to Dr. Streeter at the end of his talk. And with that, Matthew, the virtual floor is all yours.
Hey, thanks, Dr. Helmers. As was mentioned, I am a soil scientist at the University of Iowa. I don't think there's a lot of soil scientists in Eastern Iowa at the university. I'm a little bit rare, but I do have a niche that I found at the Iowa Geological Survey. A lot of the work that I do is related to soil and water quality and how we can manipulate the soil specifically to improve water quality in Iowa. Also a licensed well driller with the state. I install a lot of monitoring wells and things like that with the university. But probably about 75% of what I do at the University of Iowa is directly related to improving water quality. And we've had, I think, 3 different projects at Kirkwood Community College starting back in around 2018, just wrapping up this last year. And I want to talk about at least a couple of those today, and then one other project that I find exciting that I'm working with the Iowa Nutrient Research Center and doing. But basically, you know, 75% of my job is related to improving water quality. And why do we care about that? Probably a slide that many of you have seen before. We are concerned about all of the nitrate nitrogen that's moving into the Gulf of Mexico and creating this hypoxic zone. And we can see here in the slide that we have about 50% of the contributions to the Missouri River Basin coming from Iowa, about 47% of the contributions to the Upper Mississippi River Basin coming from Iowa. And so everything that I want to do is related to improving that water quality so that we can reduce those nitrates, so that we can reduce the hypoxic zone, preferably. Not to mention, if we think about local water quality issues and things like blue baby syndrome, when we have shallow groundwater that's contaminated with nitrates that ends up in our drinking water. So all these things are very important. That's what I do with the majority of my job. So the 3 projects that I want to briefly share with you about today, the first 2 did happen at Kirkwood Community College over the past few years, and the last one not. But the first is the effects of cattle manure, crop and soil parent material on shallow groundwater quality. So we have a site that I'll show you where we applied commercial fertilizer and cattle manure, looking for differences in groundwater quality in those conditions. And then we have a new practice that Keith Schilling and myself have been working on that's looking at grass waterways and trying to utilize those edge of field, in quote, areas to improve water quality. And the last is this evaluating the effectiveness of stacked practices. And I'm looking at modified blind inlets or French drains with a bioreactor, so to speak. So I'm just going to really briefly go through all 3 of those, try to be good on time with that, and leave plenty of time for questions. So this effects of the cattle manure, crop and soil parent material. Really our purpose here was to, I'm going to get rid of this video. Sorry, I can't see my own slides. There we go. Is to assess the effects of fertilization with cattle manure combined with commercial fertilizer on shallow groundwater quality on paired crop fields. So Kirkwood Community College has a fairly significant cattle feeding operation where they have bedded cattle manure. And so we had that available to us in relative proximity to field sites that they were managing, so we could work there. And we wanted to characterize the effects of the geologic parent materials and the crop type on these groundwater qualities. So we had a couple different parent materials, which I'll show you, that I also wanted to look at, with the overall goal of understanding how the effects of manure management and traditional in-field conditions impact groundwater quality at a field scale, so that best management practices can be developed to protect those water resources. So Kirkwood Community College is just east of the Eastern Iowa Airport, just east of Interstate 380 on the south side of Cedar Rapids. And I'm not sure if you can see my pointer. I hope that you can, but Kirkwood Community College proper is kind of up here at the north end, and then they have several of these field sites here and here, along with across the road here, that they manage and farm. They have a pretty active research farm. And for the cattle manure project, we're looking at these two paired fields here, and the cattle feeding operation is just here on the north side. So pretty close cattle feedlot where we're working. At this site, we installed shallow groundwater monitoring wells all across using hollow stem augers. So not only are we installing shallow monitoring wells, but we're also taking continuous soil core samples so we can get a really good idea about the stratigraphy wherever we're drilling a hole. Furthermore, we did a geophysical investigation across the entire site. So this is Jason Vogelgesang. He is our geophysicist at the Geological Survey, and he's showing off our EM31 conductivity meter here mounted to a gator. And we literally drove this around the entire site and surveyed the site to get a conductivity reading to about 30 feet or so across the entire site. And this can give us a really good idea about soil particle size and the geologic material beneath our feet. And this is the result of that. So you can see that all of the blue dots are monitoring wells with those hollow stem augers and the cores that we collected at this site. And then the overall background map is this terrain conductivity results that Jason provided for us. Now you can see that the highest conductivity are the areas in the red and the green. And those areas of highest conductivity are where we have glacial tills, so a lot finer materials. And then when we get into the blue and purple areas, these are coarser materials like sands and gravels. They're colluviated materials moving down slope. So we have two sides of the field, the left side and the right side, or the west and the east side, both with both of these parent material types. And we bisected those fields with those green diagonal lines heading northwest to southeast and southwest to northeast, so that we could get an area of the field that had manure, commercial fertilizer, and corn and soybeans over a 2-year period. Now, you can see from the water table monitoring that there are some pretty different, stark differences in the groundwater levels between the fine textured glacial tills and the coarse textured sand and gravel. So those coarse textured areas, the blue and the purples, have a lot deeper water tables compared to those upland glacial tills. And ultimately, based on those conductivity measurements and the water tables in the wells, we can get an idea about where water is actually moving. And in this case, this is an example of the west side of the field. You can see that water is generally moving from northwest to southeast, from the uplands, glacial tills, to those lowlands in that sand and gravel areas. So we applied manure to these fields, specifically where the corn was going to be each year. And we put somewhere around 25 tons of bedded cattle manure on the ground. You can see in this bottom right picture that when you get 25 tons per hectare of bedded cattle manure, there's not a lot of empty space left. It was pretty thick out there, as you can imagine. Not only was the cattle manure applied, but there was also a base application of commercial fertilizer, of urea, that was applied to the entire site, along with herbicide applications. So this bedded cattle manure was providing around 70 kilograms per hectare of nitrogen, which brought us up to that phosphorus rate, and we didn't want to go any higher than that. So again, back to our field monitoring. In 1 year, we had just one part of the field that was covered in manure. The other part of the field just in commercial fertilizer. For that corn year, The second year, we did the opposite over here, where we had one part of the field that had manure and the other part of the field that had just commercial fertilizer. So a 2-year study. And these are some of the results. And I know that there's a lot to look at here, and I'm not going to belabor this. But what I want to really focus on are these gray areas to show you what was actually significant, what we found that was significant. And you'll see that down here, when we look at the glacial till versus the colluvium, so those fine layered materials versus the coarse sands and gravels, this is where we found the most significance, so to speak, with all of these different analytes that we were looking at. So everything from the depth to the water, to phosphorus, to temperature, to nitrate. You can see that all of these things were significantly different between those upland glacial tills and the deeper colluviums. Now, there were some differences in some nitrate levels and some phosphorus. This is dissolved oxygen here for the manure versus not manure, but primarily what we were seeing is a significance with the parent materials. And this is just another graph showing that same thing. So you can see that in the, for example, here in the colluvium versus the glacial till, the nitrate was a lot higher in those colluvial areas. You can see that the depth to water was much shallower in that glacial till compared to the colluvium. So this is where most of the exciting things was happening. This is another box plot to show you the differences that we found when we compared no manure with manure. And you can see there's a little bit of differences in dissolved oxygen in our groundwater. The nitrate was slightly higher in the areas of the field that received the manure versus no manure. You can also see that the dissolved reactive phosphorus, so this is orthophosphorus that's moving around, was actually quite a bit higher in the areas that didn't have any manure compared to the areas that did have manure. So to just again briefly conclude what's going on here, we found that the soil parent material is really the dominant influence on groundwater quality here. So the glacial till versus the sand made way more of a difference than whether it had manure or not manure. And so those fertilizer applications from commercial fertilizer and cattle manure, they did have significant effects, although not as dominant. The nitrate nitrogen was significantly higher in the manure areas, and the orthophosphorus was higher in the non-manure areas. But the significance of the nitrate nitrogen concentrations was likely due to 70 kilograms per hectare of nitrogen applied to the manure areas of the study site. So again, I said that they had a broadcast of urea pre-plant along with herbicide, and what they actually ended up doing was over applying nitrogen in the areas that did receive the manure. This is probably why we found more nitrate there. The significance in the DRP, that's the phosphorus, was likely due to that stability of phosphorus in the manure. So we weren't seeing that phosphorus come through that first year manure was applied. So overall, what's the important things here? It's important to apply proper rates of fertilizer to crop fields, including both commercial and manure. What we found was that too high rates are going to result in nutrient leaching. And that's really what we found at Kirkwood, is that over application of 70 kilograms resulted in those higher nitrate nitrogen concentrations. However, still, this study showed that the dominant influence on groundwater quality was that soil parent material. And those sandy areas of the field pose the greatest risk for nitrogen leaching. So it's really important to know what's beneath our feet. So if you don't really know what's beneath your feet in the field, maybe take some samples and get an idea, because it's probably pretty important. So with that, I'll cruise right on to the second practice, the second project that we've been looking at Kirkwood. And now it's moving beyond Kirkwood at this point, and it's evaluating grass waterways for an edge of field practice. And I put edge of field in quotes because most of our grass waterways are really within fields. And I love the idea of being able to do things. It's not a point source issue, but it's as close to the point as you can possibly get when we're dealing with corn and soybean fields, being in the field in grass waterway situation. So when it comes to evaluating grass waterways for these practices, really we're basing this off of a simple guiding processes principle, and that is to let wet spots be wet. Some land areas were created and evolved over time to be wet. And we've done a really great job of drying these places out, but these wet areas really have a tremendous potential to improve water quality. And why is that? It's because of denitrification. So if we have anaerobic conditions, we have soil microbes that begin to respire and they get their oxygen from nitrate. instead of from atmospheric oxygen. And all we really need for that to happen is an organic carbon source. So we need a little bit of carbon for those bugs to use. We need the anaerobic conditions that happens when we have a high water table, where we don't have atmosphere in our soil pores, but we have water. And we need a nitrogen supply. Well, grass waterways typically have all of these things. And so back here at Kirkwood Community College, you can see that we have the orange dots are the row crop wells from that previous study that I was talking about. And then we have these blue dots on the map over here by the B and the A. And these are grass waterways where we installed shallow monitoring wells to just see how much water was really moving through these environments and what the potential was for water quality improvements if we were to move water back into these grass waterways. Now you can see, this is a lot of information, but just trust me, you can see that this silt percent here is pretty high. We have 50% silt, we have 30% clay. So these are fine textured soils. They're 20% or less sand. So we have a pretty fine soil that has an abundant carbon source. Our total carbon is about 1.5. You can double that for soil organic matter typically. So it's about 3% organic matter. So we have a carbon source, we have fine textured soils, and we have a high water table. So there's a lot of potential here for water quality improvements. Now for a quick comparison, to compare the upland groundwater that's not in the grass waterway compared to the water tables that are in the grass waterway, you can see that the upland groundwater is about 3 meters or so, 2 to 3 meters. That's the red line here. Whereas our grass waterway water tables are much higher, closer to the soil surface, maybe between 0.5 and 1 meter. So we have those high water tables that are going to provide those anaerobic conditions that we need for water quality improvements. So some folks at the Iowa Geological Survey, we have some modelers, and they did a groundwater flow model to look at these catchments. This is the one southwest of that previous study site. And you can see that we are discharging from these waterways approximately 53 cubic meters per day of water from this field. That's the potential here. Now, if we use that 53 number and we assume that our concentrations averaged about 3.1 milligrams per liter in the drainage ways, about 10.5 in the crop fields, we could estimate nitrogen load reduction in this field of about 7.8 kilograms per hectare per year. So not an insignificant amount of nitrogen that we could be reducing from this environment if we were to resaturate these grass waterways. So what is the implication for this grass waterway? If we look at the agricultural conservation planning framework, we identified about 826 potential grass waterway sites in Hoosier Creek, which is the watershed where Kirkwood Community College is. And if we were to actually resaturate all of those grass waterways, we could look at N loads reduced by about 119,000 kilograms per year, or a reduction of about 39%. In that watershed. So if we were to actually utilize these organic rich waterways for water quality improvements, it could be significant. So to conclude with this, nitrate nitrogen loads from tile drainage export will need to be reduced in order to meet nutrient reduction goals. We know this. And beyond the list of current BMPs for tile drainage remediation, connecting tiles to grass waterways is a new conservation opportunity that should be explored. And we are exploring this further. Just to add on to this, I don't have a slide for it, but we are actually working on installing a new practice this fall, hopefully, where we are going to be using some agri-drain water gates to start backing water up into these grass waterways to see just exactly how much nutrient reduction benefits we can get. So those will be installed this fall, and more good things to come next year. Hopefully we'll get some nice results out of that. And the last thing that I want to talk about is not a project that we've done at Kirkwood Community College, but this is a new project that we're doing with the Iowa Nutrient Research Center. And it's evaluating the effectiveness of stacked practices. That's our title, using modified blind inlets at terrace sites for nitrogen and phosphorus load reductions. Now, these modified blind inlets have also been called alternative tile intakes. We've been working on these since 2018. We began with a conservation innovation grant with the Natural Resources Conservation Service. And this is kind of a next step to that. And what you're seeing on this title slide here is a completed modified blind inlet. And I will show you a bunch more pictures. But it's just so you know, these are up and running right now. So we have, I think, 5 of these currently installed, and we're measuring water quality improvements in 2 of these, and we're slated to install a couple more of these up in Northeast Iowa and Floyd County this fall. So there should be 7, maybe 8 of these by the time we're done this fall. So there are a few of these already in the ground. Now, what is a modified blind inlet? A modified blind inlet essentially takes this standard tile inlet, these orange standpipes that we see all over the state of Iowa, and we remove those. A traditional blind inlet, or like a French drain, would be just filled with gravel to provide a filter for that water. And instead of just providing that filter, what we're doing is we are adding a wood chip bioreactor of sorts at the bottom of this ditch. So we're removing this tile inlet, we're adding wood chips and a perforated tile and covering that in gravel for a filter. And we're seeing what kind of denitrification benefits we can get from this system. Now, here are a few pictures to share with this. So you can see on the left, this is a typical graded terrace. This is a farm terrace that's in Keokuk County. It's near the town of Keota. Keota is just about a mile from here. And that's what it looked like before we began. The whole process, which included installing all of our sensors and monitoring equipment, only took about 3 or 4 hours to do the install. But we essentially, we dig a trench and we intercept all of the surface water runoff into this new trench that we filled with wood chips. There's about a foot of wood chips in the bottom of this trench. And then we backfill the rest of that with gravel and P-rock. So now we are intercepting all of the surface runoff. It's going through a gravel filter to get sediment. It's a sediment filter. And then as that water saturates those wood chips, again, we provide that organic rich anaerobic environment where hopefully denitrification will occur. Now, the great thing about blind inlets specifically is that farmers no longer have anything to farm around. So we've taken that orange standpipe and we've removed it. And you'll see in my right picture here of our finished product, we have an AgriDrain structure that's actually monitoring flow. We have real-time nitrate. We have all these things that we're measuring. But in a real world, if somebody were going to use these things, that wouldn't even be there. So all you're going to see when you walk away is just some gravel on the ground that the farmer can manage right over the top of. There's no more pulling around tile inlets. So it's a pretty exciting practice, and they're relatively inexpensive. So I think that again, without the monitoring equipment, these can be installed in just a couple of hours for probably $400 to $500. So they're not an expensive undertaking. So this picture is showing a little bit more of our monitoring apparatus. So we've got a surface water sump that has a couple of flow actuators in it that are triggering 2 automatic ISCO water samplers. So when it begins to rain and we get actual significant runoff, then the runoff goes into our sump. It triggers these automatic water samplers, and they begin to take samples every 10 minutes over the course of about 4 hours so that we can see how the water going in and the water coming out and what kind of water quality improvements we're getting. We also have dual tipping bucket rain gauges, so we know exactly how much it's raining at the site. We have real-time nitrate levels coming out of this practice with a NitroTax. And we also have real-time flow. So if we actually get a significant rain event, which has been very difficult this year to get significant rain, we are absolutely set up to see just how good these things are going to work. But that being said, we have had some of these out in the past. Again, we started working with these in 2018. We were not able to get load reductions in our 2018 to 21 study because we didn't have good flow, but we were able to get nitrate concentration reductions. You can see these are a few photos from some of the events that we sampled where we had some significant rainfall. Our ISCOs, again, are pumping water every 10 minutes to see what happens. And during that study, during that initial study, we found a 43% reduction in nitrate from the surface water to the tile water. So that was a really kind of promising reduction in nitrate. We had several questions to begin with as to whether or not these could really be effective at denitrifying when the wood chips dry out, because it takes time for this denitrification process to begin once they become saturated. In reality, it really doesn't take very long at all. And we found that denitrification was happening almost immediately once those wood chips became saturated. So again, we are anxiously awaiting some rain this year and hopefully next year so that we can get load reductions and have a better idea about how well these practices are working. So with that, I think I'll quit. I tried to leave plenty of time for questions. So I've got those three projects that we talked about, the manure versus commercial fertilizer, the grassed waterways and trying to resaturate those, and then our modified blind inlets and using those for denitrification potential. And so if you've got any questions about those, please let me know, or anything else that excites you about water quality in the state. I'd be glad to chat with you more.
All right. Thank you, Matthew. That was great. We are getting some questions coming in, but if you have others, please feel free to type those in the chat box, and maybe we can go to the next slide. If that's got if you watch this webinar live and you want to and need to earn a CCA CEU, please send the following information to Elena Whitaker. Her email is alenaw@iastate.edu. Please do that by 5 o'clock today and include your name, the name you entered to watch the webinar, and your CCA number. And then if you, next slide. If you watch this webinar live, if you're willing to fill out a voluntary survey, be greatly appreciated. If you've already submitted for a webinar from 2023, thank you very much, and you don't need to do it again, but you can either scan the QR code or you can go to iowalearningfarms.org/survey. Really greatly appreciate that if you're willing to fill out that voluntary survey for us. So thank you. And a plug for next week. The webinar is, if you can go to the next slide.
Yes. There.
We got Paul Miller with Iowa Department of Agriculture and Land Stewardship. He's the urban conservationist, and he's going to talk about the Iowa Stormwater Management Manual, tools and updates. Okay, let's go to some of the questions, Matt. Okay, and I did share out a link to a virtual field day we did with Dr. Streeter and Dr. Schilling and Mike Poston, the farmer, for the virtual field day. And so the link is in there. So go watch that at your heart's content. Okay. There was a question on the first one where you're using the cattle manure. Did you ever test with just manure alone?
No. So Kirkwood is a active farm, and they were not able to provide sufficient nitrogen. So we thought with just the cattle manure based on those phosphorus levels. So they were going to definitely apply that base application of urea, which ultimately proved to be too much nitrogen. But no, we were not able to do just cattle manure alone.
Okay. Next one, was any nitrate testing done on Hoosier Creek downstream from Kirkwood?
We did not look at surface nitrate water in the creek. We were only looking at the groundwater in our monitoring wells in the fields.
Okay. Okay, can you explain a little more what you're thinking with saturating these waterways?
So the idea of saturating the waterways, and I know I went through this really quick, but the idea of saturating the waterways, all of these waterways in the state generally have a higher carbon content because they're naturally wetter environments. not only do they have a higher carbon content typically at the soil surface, but in a lot of these areas in ag fields in Iowa, we have what we call post-settlement alluvium, where eroded soils have moved from infield and they have started working into these grass waterway environments. And beneath that post-settlement alluvium, we have an even richer carbon environment where we have these buried soils. Now, these high carbon buried soils are great places for potential denitrification. So most grass waterways in Iowa are tiled, right? We're trying to dry those out so that farmers can move across them on implements, and those tiles are maybe draining those soils down to about a meter, 4 feet-ish or so. A lot of these buried soils that have these high carbon environments are 3 to 4 feet within the soil. So they're fairly deep in the soil profile already. So when I talk about resaturating these grass waterways, I'm not really interested in saturating the grass waterway all the way to the soil surface like we would do with a saturated buffer, for example. But with these AgriDrain control boxes, we can only increase the water levels or the shallow groundwater levels by about a foot. And so if we saturate those shallow groundwater levels by about a foot, we start to put water through this carbon-rich subsoil, this buried soil again, and we start to see denitrification. Now, that's the idea in theory. We have a few wells, again, through these grass waterways. We need to see how much water we can actually move through them. So I know that they'll denitrify, but it's also a matter of moving enough water through them to be effective, right? And so are we saying that if we pull the water up a foot, can we even move enough water to make it matter? So that's really the question that we're trying to answer this fall is because we don't want to raise the water all the way back to the soil surface. We'll cause erosion in grass waterways where the managers won't be able to drive across them anymore. But if we just raise up that water table a little ways, redirect some water back into these carbon-rich environments, can it be an effective way to improve water quality?
Great, thank you. The next one is, are there any studies that compare the use of blind inlets versus saturated buffers to improve water quality?
So I don't know about direct comparisons between saturated buffers and the blind inlets. Of course, the modified blind inlet that we're talking about is really more of a bioreactor with those wood chips at the base, whereas a saturated buffer is saturating the soils, the carbon-rich soils themselves in riparian zones. I know that we've done a lot of work at the Geological Survey and Tom Eisenhart, Iowa State. A lot of other folks have done a lot of work on saturated buffers, and they're highly effective, and they really don't take a lot of real estate at the edge of the stream to be effective for nutrient reduction, for nitrate reduction. But at the same time, I know that our modified blind inlets in field, while they're not going to have the catchment size, right? These are individual inlets, have also shown to be pretty effective.
Okay, great. Next one here is, with all the bioreactors, the wood media needs to be replaced over time. How easy or difficult might it be to maintain a modified blind inlet with that rock on top?
That's a really great question, and I didn't discuss this at all in the talk, but we have an original alternative tile intake, modified blind inlet, that was installed by Thanos Papanucleau, and it is in the neighborhood of 12 or 13 years old now, and it's out by Amana, west of Iowa City. Now, that modified blind inlet, when we were measuring that for water quality improvements during this study, it was about 10 years old, and it was still functioning very well. So I have found that there's maybe a little bit of subsidence or compaction with that wood chips over the first year or two. We've had to top off a little bit with the rock, but all implications are from this one that is old, that they are still functioning very well. Now, that being said, when it stops functioning, when those wood chips are wore out, so to speak, you either get a backhoe in and dig those up and reinstall with new wood chips, or you have essentially a blind inlet filter without the nitrogen reduction benefits. So I think that it would still function as a normal blind inlet, even if the wood chips were expired, but it wouldn't be that hard to dig it up and replace them.
Okay. That was there a couple questions about that lifespan. So that'll be hopefully can do some long-term monitoring on these too to see with the new ones that are going in how well they perform.
Yes, and I do have plans for our 2018 installs. They're actually very close to our new installs to go back and try to capture some of those samples when they go back to corn next year. So we'll have some ideas about maybe some 5-year or so old modified blind inlets and get an idea about how those are functioning.
Okay. I don't know if this was part of the study where you looked at it, but there was a question of what % of the potential waterways in that watershed where you did the analysis currently have grassed waterways?
That's a really good question, and I don't know. So the Iowa State University has done a BMP mapping project where you have existing grassed waterways, and it's not that hard to look that up and to find out where those are actually mapped compared to where they could be. And honestly, I probably have already done that, but I cannot tell you right now. I completely forget. But there are a lot of grassed waterways in eastern Iowa. So I would argue that probably a pretty significant portion of those are already grassed. There's a lot of grassed waterways in eastern Iowa.
Okay, there was a question here. Grassed waterways might, be up to 3 to 5% slope. How many control structures might you need in that, say, 1,000 foot?
Yeah, so we were again with these control structures. They're completely subsurface gates, so it's not like one of these surface control structures that you think about with the AgriDrain gates, but it's completely subsurface. They're non-managed. Once they're in, they're in. We are able to raise that water table either 12 inches or 24 inches with the current design. So the slope is really kind of this law of diminishing returns, right? So if the slope gets too steep, our distance of rise over that waterway is going to be so small that we won't have any benefit. And I don't know the exact numbers for that, for the diminishing returns, but I will say that I think a few hundred feet, probably 300 to 500 feet over an elevation rise of 2 to 3%, something like that is going to be probably kind of the upper limits. You start looking at 5, 6, 7% slopes, and all of a sudden you've got that 2 feet of elevation rise over such a short distance. It's not going to be effective. Now that's my really bad mental math right now, but we're not looking at really steep grassed waterways. They still have to be relatively shallow.
Okay, great. In this one, they ask if the wood chips were organic. They were wondering if they're treated with anything, but no, I don't think they're treated with anything, just regular old wood chips.
Yeah, these are just hardwood chips. I think if you want to talk to somebody about wood chips, and he's on my list of people to talk about wood chips, is Billy Beck, Iowa State University, who's doing some work to find out which wood chips are best for denitrification. I know there are some wood chips that are really bad, like cedars, but these were just hardwood chips, pine and oak, that were, some of these were even bagged like from Menards, and others were bulk wood chips that we got from door factories and things like that. It's trying to find things that are easily accessible to people. So, real world environment, there's nothing special about these wood chips at all.
Okay. Great. Let me double check. I think that pretty much got all our questions, because many of them there were quite a few on people were thinking the same thing. They all wondered about the longevity. So, Dr. Streeter, thank you so much for this. Maybe you can go back a couple slides and I'll just put the plug in. If you need a CCA CEU, please email Elena Whitaker by 5 o'clock today with your name, the name you entered to watch the webinar, and your CCA number. And again, her email is alenaw@iastate.edu. And then I'd encourage you to log in next week. Paul Miller will be talking about some of the Iowa stormwater management manual updates and tools. So please tune in. And then, as always, the webinar will be archived as long as the recording worked, and that'll be up on the Iowa Learning Farms website. And feel free to go back and watch any of the other webinars you might have missed. With that, any last comments, Matthew?
No, thanks a lot for having me, and keep your eyes out for future work with these grass waterways and the blind inlets, because they're just getting installed. Good things are to come over the next year or so. We'll have a lot of great data to share, I'm sure.
Okay. Thanks so much.